July 1944, Aldershot, England. The summer air hung thick and warm inside the Red Lion pub. Canadian soldiers sat shoulder to shoulder with American GIs around wooden tables worn smooth by years of use. Laughter bounced off the stone walls. The smell of beer and cigarettes mixed with the scent of the kitchen's meat pies. Outside, the evening sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone street. For a few precious hours, the war felt far away. Men who had seen too much death were trying to remember what it felt like to be alive. Then, the door slammed open. 4 American military police stormed inside. Their white helmets gleamed under the pub's dim lights. Their white armbands stood out stark against their dark uniforms. Their boots hit the floor hard with each step. The room went quiet. Conversations died mid-sentence. Someone set down a glass with a soft clink that seemed loud in the sudden silence. The lead MP's eyes scanned the crowd. They stopped on a table near the back. 3 black American soldiers sat there with 5 Canadian troops. They had been sharing stories and drinks like any group of friends would. The MP pointed. His voice cut through the quiet like a knife. "You 3! Out! Now!" The black soldiers looked confused. One started to stand. A Canadian private next to him put a hand on his shoulder. "What's the problem, mate?" the Canadian asked. His voice was calm, but his jaw was tight. "These men aren't supposed to be here," the MP said. He walked toward the table. His hand rested on his baton. "We have rules about mixing." More than 130,000 black American soldiers were serving overseas in 1944. They had crossed an ocean to fight fascism. They worked as truck drivers, port battalions, engineers, and supply units. They built the roads and bridges that let armies move. They unloaded the ships that kept troops fed and armed. Without them, the war effort would have ground to a halt. But the U.S. Army treated them as second-class soldiers. Jim Crow laws from back home followed them across the Atlantic. American command insisted that black and white troops be kept separate. They demanded that British and Canadian hosts respect these rules. Most of the time, to keep the alliance strong, British and Canadian leaders looked the other way. The Canadian soldiers at the table didn't move. "They're our mates," another Canadian said. His accent was thick with the flat vowels of Manitoba. "They're drinking in a Canadian establishment, on British soil." "I don't care whose soil we're on," the MP said. He was close to the table now. "American personnel follow American rules. These 3 are out of bounds." A chair scraped against the floor. A tall Canadian corporal stood up. His uniform showed the maple leaf shoulder patch of the Royal Canadian Engineers. "You're not taking anyone out of here," he said. His voice was steady. Other Canadians at nearby tables started to stand too. The MP's face went red. "You're interfering with military police business. Step aside or you'll be reported." For months, incidents like this had been building across England. American MPs patrolled towns near their bases looking for black soldiers in white-only establishments. They would drag them out, sometimes roughly. British pub owners didn't like it, but American officers pressured them to cooperate. Local people complained, but their voices didn't carry much weight. The official policy from British command was clear. Don't make waves. Don't upset the Americans. The alliance needed to stay strong. Everyone was supposed to bend to keep things smooth. But the Canadians had never been asked to enforce these rules. And now, faced with MPs trying to remove their friends, something inside them refused. The corporal stepped between the MPs and the black soldiers. "You heard me wrong," he said. "I'm not stepping aside." The lead MP's hand tightened on his baton. "Last warning. Move or be moved." "Try it," the corporal said quietly. The pub was packed with Canadian troops. They all watched now. Some stood. Some shifted their weight, ready to move if needed. The 3 black GIs sat frozen, caught between wanting to avoid trouble and feeling something they hadn't felt in a long time. Protection. Someone willing to stand with them instead of just walking away. Outside, a jeep pulled up fast. Gravel crunched under its tires. A Canadian captain climbed out. He had been eating dinner at the officers' mess when word reached him about trouble at the Red Lion. He pushed through the pub door and took in the scene immediately. 4 American MPs facing off against 24 Canadian enlisted men. The air felt electric, like the moment before lightning strikes. "What's happening here?" the captain asked. His voice carried the authority of command, but he directed the question at his own men first. The corporal didn't take his eyes off the MP. "These Americans are trying to remove our friends, sir. I told them no." The captain looked at the black soldiers. He looked at his men. He looked at the American MPs whose hands were still on their batons. Every officer in the Canadian military knew the official policy. Don't interfere with American internal matters. Keep things friendly. But standing there in that pub, watching American police trying to enforce segregation in a Canadian space, something clicked in the captain's mind. He thought about what his country stood for. He thought about the men under his command who had just risked their lives in Normandy fighting against Hitler's ideas about racial superiority. He thought about right and wrong. The captain turned to the lead MP. "This is a Canadian establishment," he said slowly. "These men are guests of Canadian soldiers. You have no authority here." His words hung in the air like smoke. They were simple, they were direct, and they challenged everything about how things were supposed to work. The lead American MP's face went from red to purple. "You're making a serious mistake, Captain. My orders come from U.S. command. These men violated segregation policy." The Canadian captain crossed his arms. "Your orders don't apply here. This pub is under Canadian jurisdiction. These soldiers are our guests. That's the end of it." For a long moment, nobody moved. The tension stretched tight like a wire about to snap. The American MPs looked at each other. They were used to people backing down. British pub owners usually cooperated. British officers usually stayed out of it. But these Canadians weren't budging. The corporal still stood like a wall between the MPs and the black soldiers. Other Canadians had formed a loose circle around the table. Their faces were set hard. The lead MP pointed his finger at the captain. "You'll hear about this. Count on it." He turned on his heel and walked out. His men followed. The door slammed behind them. Their Jeep engine roared to life outside. Gravel sprayed as they drove away fast. The pub erupted. Canadians cheered. They clapped the corporal on the back. Someone bought a round of drinks for the whole room. The 3 Black GIs sat quiet at first, looking stunned. One of them, a private from Georgia named James Mitchell, had tears in his eyes. He stood and shook the captain's hand. His voice shook when he spoke. "Thank you, sir. Nobody's ever done something like that for us." The captain shook his head. "You're soldiers, same as any of us. You deserve to drink in peace." He turned to address the room. "That goes for everyone here. Any American soldier is welcome in Canadian establishments. I don't care what color they are. Is that clear?" The Canadians roared their agreement, but the captain knew this wasn't over. He was right. 2 days later, an American colonel showed up at Canadian headquarters in Aldershot. He was angry. He carried formal complaints from U.S. Military Police Command. Canadian officers were interfering with American discipline, he said. They were undermining good order. They were creating problems between allies. The Canadian brigadier who met with him listened politely. Then he said something the American didn't expect. "Colonel, we respect American authority over American personnel on American bases, but in Canadian-controlled areas, Canadian law applies. We don't practice segregation in Canada. We won't enforce it here." The American colonel's face went white. "This is about military discipline, not politics." "No," the brigadier said quietly. "This is about how we treat soldiers who are fighting the same enemy we are. My answer is no. We won't help you segregate troops in our establishments." The American colonel left furious. He went straight to higher British command. Surely they would pressure the Canadians to cooperate. The alliance was too important to risk over something like this. But when British generals raised the issue with Canadian leadership, they got a similar response. Some British officers privately agreed with the Canadians. They had never liked enforcing American segregation either. The whole thing made them uncomfortable. Word of the Red Lion incident spread fast through Canadian units. Within a week, similar confrontations happened in 3 other towns. In Farnborough, Canadian military police physically blocked American MPs from entering a dance hall where Black GIs were dancing with local British women. In Camberley, a Canadian sergeant major told American MPs to leave his men alone or face consequences. In each case, the Canadians stood firm. They wouldn't let American police remove black soldiers from Canadian spaces. Canadian commanders met quietly and came to an unofficial agreement. They couldn't change American policy on American bases. They couldn't tell the U.S. Army how to run itself, but they could control their own spaces. Canadian recreation halls, Canadian pubs, Canadian social clubs. These would be open to all soldiers regardless of race. No exceptions. The order went out through the chain of command, though it was never written down officially. Everyone understood. Canadian territory meant Canadian rules. For Black American soldiers, this news felt like a miracle. Private Mitchell and his friends from that first night at the Red Lion told everyone they knew. Canadian zones were safe. Canadian soldiers had their backs. Word spread through the all-black units that worked the supply lines. It passed between truck drivers during long convoys. Engineers building bridges shared it. Port Battalion soldiers unloading ships whispered it to each other. By August 1944, a pattern had formed. On weekend passes, Black GIs would ask around, "Where are the Canadians stationed? Which towns had Canadian units?" They would travel extra miles to reach those places. They knew they could relax there without looking over their shoulders for MPs. They could drink a beer without fear. They could talk to local women without being dragged away. They could feel for a few hours like regular soldiers instead of second-class citizens. Canadian establishments became packed on weekends. The Maple Leaf Club in Aldershot was wall-to-wall with soldiers of every color. The New Brunswick Social Hall in Farnborough held dances where black and white troops mixed freely. Canadian military police stood at the doors, but not to keep anyone out. They stood there to keep American MPs from getting in. American white MPs tried different approaches. They complained to British civil authorities. They threatened Canadian soldiers with creating international incidents. They sent reports up the chain of command demanding action. Nothing worked. The Canadians had made their decision and they stuck to it. Some American officers privately fumed. Others quietly admired the Canadians' courage to stand on principle. Some white American soldiers started to notice too. They saw Canadian troops treating Black GIs as equals. They saw the respect and friendship that developed. A few began to question the used segregation they had always accepted as normal. Not many, not enough to change things, but seeds of doubt were planted. In combat zones in France, unexpected bonds formed. Canadian units fighting alongside all Black American support battalions developed trust. When Canadian engineers needed supplies moved fast under fire, they knew the Black truckers would come through. When Black port battalions needed protection while unloading under air attack, Canadian troops stood guard. They had shared drinks together. They had stood together against injustice. Now they stood together against the enemy. The solution was simple, but it required courage. Canadian soldiers and officers chose to enforce their own values in their own spaces. They didn't try to change American policy everywhere. They couldn't, but they could control what happened in Canadian territory. And that made all the difference for thousands of Black soldiers who finally found places where they were treated with dignity. By September 1944, the impact was impossible to ignore. Before the Canadian intervention, Black GIs in southern England faced constant harassment. Military police reports showed an average of 47 incidents per week, where Black soldiers were removed from establishments or arrested for being in white areas. After Canadian zones became safe havens, those numbers dropped by more than half in areas with Canadian presence. Black soldiers knew where they could go without trouble. They avoided the dangerous spots and flocked to Canadian territory. The Maple Leaf Club in Aldershot saw its attendance triple. On Saturday nights, over 300 soldiers packed the hall. 2/3 of them were Black Americans. They danced to swing music. They played cards. They laughed without constantly checking the door for white helmets. The Canadian soldiers who ran the club kept careful records. Before July, they averaged 90 visitors per weekend. By October, that number had jumped to 270. The change was dramatic and measurable. British civilians noticed too. In towns with Canadian units, local people saw something unusual. Black and white soldiers mixing freely, sharing tables at pubs, walking down streets together, dancing with British women at the same halls. Many British citizens had never liked the segregation rules anyway. Seeing the Canadians refuse to enforce them gave them courage to speak up too. Mrs. Dorothy Williams ran a tea shop in Farnborough. She wrote in her diary about what she witnessed. The Canadian boys treat the colored Americans as brothers. They stand together at my counter. They joke and tease each other like old friends. When American police tried to make trouble last week, 3 Canadians blocked my door and said nobody was bothering their mates. I was so proud I cried. This is how decent people behave. But the American military command wasn't giving up. In October 1944, a formal diplomatic protest reached Canadian military headquarters through official British channels. The complaint was harsh. It accused Canadian forces of undermining American military discipline. It claimed that Canadian interference was damaging troop morale. It suggested that Canadian actions were motivated by trying to make Americans look bad. The document demanded immediate compliance with American segregation policies in all areas where American troops were present. General Andrew MacNaughton, commander of Canadian forces in Europe, read the complaint carefully. He was a practical man who understood politics. He knew the alliance with America was critical. Canada needed American support to win the war. Cooperation mattered, but he also knew his soldiers. He had seen their reports. He had heard their reasoning. Most importantly, he understood what Canada stood for. MacNaughton called a meeting with his senior officers. They discussed the situation for 3 hours. Some argued for compromise. Maybe they could quietly discourage the practice without officially changing it. Maybe they could ask their men to be less confrontational. But others argued back. Canadian soldiers were standing up for what was right. They weren't causing trouble. They were preventing it. They were treating all Allied soldiers with dignity. Why should Canada back down from that? In the end, MacNaughton made his decision. He sent back a carefully worded response. Canadian forces would continue to operate under Canadian values in Canadian-controlled facilities. They respected American authority over American personnel on American bases. But Canadian territory meant Canadian rules. The letter was polite but firm. There would be no compliance with segregation in Canadian zones. American command tried a different approach. They issued new orders to black units. Certain towns were now off limits, specifically towns with large Canadian populations. The orders didn't say why directly, but everyone knew. They were trying to keep black soldiers away from the Canadians, but the orders were hard to enforce. Black soldiers found ways around them. They would get passes to nearby towns, then travel to Canadian areas anyway. They would visit friends who had legitimate reasons to be there. The restrictions were full of holes. Some American officers privately disagreed with their own command's position. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Ray, who commanded a black quartermaster battalion, wrote to his wife back home. His letter survived the war. The Canadians treat my men like human beings. They don't see color first and soldiers second. They see soldiers, period. My men work harder and fight better when they're treated with respect. I wish our own command understood that. The comparison with British handling of the situation was stark. British forces had taken a mixed approach. Some British commanders supported their Canadian allies. Others enforced American segregation to keep peace. In towns where British forces cooperated with American MPs, tension was high. Fights broke out regularly. Black soldiers felt betrayed. White MPs felt emboldened. The atmosphere was ugly and getting worse. But in Canadian areas, something different happened. Violence went down. Cooperation went up. Canadian military police reports showed a 70% drop in serious incidents in their zones compared to British-only areas. Men who felt respected behaved better. Men who were constantly harassed pushed back. The statistics proved what the Canadians had believed all along. Dignity prevented problems rather than causing them. The vivid contrast played out every weekend. In Portsmouth, where British command strictly enforced American segregation, military police made an average of 12 arrests per Saturday night. Fights were common. Property got damaged. In nearby Aldershot, where Canadians controlled most recreation facilities, arrests averaged fewer than 3 per weekend. The difference wasn't because different soldiers went to different towns. It was because of how they were treated when they got there. Unexpected consequences emerged that nobody had predicted. Black and white American soldiers who spent time in Canadian zones started to bond in ways that hadn't happened before. Shared experiences of Canadian hospitality broke down some barriers. White soldiers from northern states, who already felt uncomfortable with segregation, found their views reinforced. A few southern white soldiers began questioning beliefs they had grown up with. The numbers were small, but the impact was real. Combat performance showed the effects too. In October 1944, Canadian engineering units worked closely with the all-black 183rd Engineer Combat Battalion during operations in Belgium. The black unit was building a critical bridge under constant German artillery fire. Canadian troops provided security and helped with construction. The bridge went up in record time, 48 hours instead of the estimated 72. The Canadian commander's report praised the Americans' skill and courage. He noted that the mutual respect built during off-duty hours in England had created trust that paid off under fire. The bond worked both ways. When Canadian troops needed urgent supplies moved through dangerous territory in November, black truckers of the 666th Quartermaster Truck Company volunteered for the job. They drove through the night under threat of German ambush. They remembered the Canadians who had stood up for them back in England. They were willing to take risks for men who had shown them respect. By December 1944, the pattern was fully established. Across southern England, approximately 60 Canadian-controlled facilities operated as integrated spaces. More than 5,000 black American soldiers visited these places regularly. The Canadian zones had become islands of equality in a sea of segregation. American command had tried protests, diplomatic pressure, and restrictions. Nothing worked. The Canadians wouldn't budge. And the positive results spoke for themselves. Lower violence, better morale, stronger bonds between units that would soon fight together in the final push into Germany. The scale was significant, but not overwhelming. Canadians didn't change the entire system. They couldn't. But they changed enough to matter. They created spaces where thousands of black soldiers could feel human again, where they could rest without fear, where they could remember why they crossed an ocean to fight tyranny in the first place. When the war ended in May 1945, thousands of black American soldiers returned home. They came back to a country that still enforced Jim Crow laws. They had fought fascism overseas. They had risked their lives for freedom, but they couldn't drink from the same water fountains as white Americans. They couldn't sit at the front of buses. They couldn't eat at most restaurants. The contrast with how Canadians had treated them was painful and sharp. Many of those veterans never forgot what happened in England. Private James Mitchell, the soldier from Georgia who had been at the Red Lion that first night, kept a small Canadian flag in his wallet for the rest of his life. He told his children and grandchildren about the Canadian captain who stood up for him when nobody else would, about the corporal who refused to move, about feeling, for the first time in his life, like someone saw him as a man first and a black man second. In the decades after the war, some black veterans made a different choice. Between 1945 and 1965, approximately 2,000 black Americans immigrated to Canada. Not all of them were former soldiers, but many were. They remembered the respect they had received. They remembered Canadian soldiers treating them as equals. When they decided to leave the segregated American South, they thought of Canada. They thought of a place where they might be judged by who they were rather than the color of their skin. The Canadian soldiers who took that stand in 1944 rarely talked about it. Most didn't think they had done anything special. When asked years later, they gave simple answers. It was the right thing to do. They were soldiers, same as us. We don't treat people that way in Canada. They didn't see themselves as heroes. They saw themselves as decent people who refused to go along with something wrong. The captain who faced down the American MPs at the Red Lion went back to civilian life after the war. He became a school teacher in Ontario. He never sought recognition for what happened that night. His family only learned the full story after he died in 1982. Among his papers, they found letters from Black American veterans thanking him. One letter came every Christmas for 37 years from James Mitchell. The captain had kept every single one. But the impact of what those Canadians did went deeper than individual stories. It became part of how Canada saw itself. In the 1950s and 1960s, as Canada built its identity as separate from the United States, stories about standing up to American segregation became part of the national narrative. Canadians told these stories with quiet pride. We stood for equality when others didn't. We treated people with dignity even when it was inconvenient. We chose what was right over what was easy. This wasn't just myth-making. The Canadian military learned real lessons from 1944. After the war, Canadian forces made integration a core value. When they built their permanent military, they emphasized treating all soldiers equally regardless of background. This happened years before the American military integrated in 1948. The experiences in England had shown Canadian commanders that respect and equality made better soldiers, not worse ones. They had the data to prove it. The approach that started in those English pubs quietly transformed into standard Canadian practice. By the 1960s, Canada was accepting refugees and immigrants from around the world. The country was building a reputation as a place of tolerance and multiculturalism. The seeds of that reputation were planted partly by soldiers who refused to enforce racism in 1944. They showed that Canadian values meant something real, not just words on paper. The broader lesson was about moral courage in small moments. The Canadian soldiers at the Red Lion didn't change the whole American system. They couldn't. They didn't end segregation or transform military policy, but they changed their corner of the world. They made their spaces safe. They stood up when it would have been easier to look away. And that mattered enormously to the men they protected. History often focuses on big moments and famous leaders. We learn about presidents and generals who made sweeping changes. But most progress happens in smaller ways. It happens when ordinary people decide they won't go along with injustice, when they draw a line and say no, when they risk consequences to do what's right. The Canadians in England in 1944 did exactly that. They weren't famous. They didn't make speeches or lead movements. They just refused to cooperate with racism in their own spaces. And that refusal rippled outward in ways they never imagined. The story connects directly to struggles that continue today. Systemic racism didn't end in 1945 or 1965 or even now. The fight for equal treatment and dignity is ongoing. What the Canadian soldiers demonstrated still matters. They showed that you don't have to have perfect power to make a difference. You don't have to change everything to change something. You can control how you treat people in your own sphere. You can refuse to enforce unjust rules, even when pressure is strong. They also showed what real allyship looks like. It's not just words of support. It's not just feeling bad about injustice. It's standing up when it costs you something. It's putting your body between your friends and those who want to harm them. It's being willing to face consequences. The Canadian corporal who blocked the American MPs risked his career. The captain who backed him up risked diplomatic trouble. They did it anyway because they believed treating people with dignity mattered more than avoiding conflict. The bonds formed between Canadian and Black American soldiers proved that respect builds strength. Units that trained together and socialized together fought better together. Trust developed off-duty paid off under fire. This wasn't theoretical. It was proven in combat across France, Belgium, and Germany. The Canadian engineers and Black American truckers who had shared drinks in Aldershot worked together flawlessly under enemy fire months later. Mutual respect created efficiency that top-down orders never could. What makes the story powerful is its humanity. These weren't saints or perfect people. They were regular soldiers who got tired and scared, and sometimes made mistakes. But when faced with a clear choice between right and wrong, they chose right. They didn't overthink it. They didn't calculate political consequences. They saw friends being mistreated and they stepped in. It was that simple and that profound. The philosophical truth at the heart of this story is about friendship and loyalty. True allies don't just stand with you when it's convenient. They stand with you when it's hard. They challenge your government when your government is wrong. They prioritize your dignity over diplomatic smoothness. The Canadians understood that the American soldiers sitting in their pubs were individuals deserving respect, not symbols of a policy they had to enforce. In the end, the story teaches us that moral courage doesn't require special training or unique bravery. It requires deciding what matters. The Canadian soldiers decided that human dignity mattered more than avoiding trouble. They decided that their values meant something real. They decided that you don't let friends be dragged away for no reason other than hatred. That decision, made in a pub in England 80 years ago, echoes forward to today. It reminds us that we all face moments where we can choose to enforce injustice or resist it, where we can look away or step forward, where we can stay silent or speak up. The Canadians chose resistance. They chose to step forward. They chose to speak. And in doing so, they showed that ordinary people in ordinary moments can create extraordinary change, one act of dignity at a time.